Hi, we complete Genesis 37 today with a short but poignant scene of the brothers sending the robe of Jacob covered with goat blood back to their father to see if he recognizes it as that of his son. And after withholding his emotions and seeming to be indifferent so much to what's going on amongst his sons, suddenly Jacob's emotions overflow in a couple of verses with a huge sequence of mourning expressions, both in word and bodily gesture. So we'll see how this chapter ends, and how it sets up a terrifying, in many ways, reunion of the family much later, after Joseph is established in Egypt as a leader, as a dream interpreter, as we'll see in the coming chapters. So if you haven't watched the introductory video for this unit, I really encourage you to do so, where we go over these materials on the right side of the screen here that I've been pointing to throughout this unit. And today we're particularly looking at the character of Jacob, among other things here, and how he's portrayed so differently in this particular scene than he was earlier, and how he'll be portrayed differently as we go. In terms of the shape of the story, I've been noting throughout the deep unity of this unit 37 to 41, and we've been seeing that through here, and the supposed two different sources of Midianite and Ishmaelite sales, as I've been noting, is obviated by the reality that this story is all about doubling individual words in the form of the infinitive absolute that Hebrew uses to emphasize things, but also doubling in different places, or tripling, as we can see in a number of places, including the double plans for Reuben and Judah, and of the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. Today we're going to see the theme around recognizing and comfort and tearing and selling, all here at the end. Key words that are expressed in doubles and triples in the situation we see here. And in the shape of our immediate scene, this is part of this chiasm that we went up to here last time. I didn't go over the chiasm last time, but you can see how tight it is. Several elements connect the A and the A prime parts. Midianite traders, Midianites, taking him to Egypt and selling him twice there. And then in the first B part, Reuben tears his clothes and mourns. In the B prime part, Jacob tears his clothes and mourns. And the middle part is repeated several times, as you can see, the question of the long robe with sleeves, which it is, but of course it's not Jacob's blood. Too bad they didn't have DNA testing in those days, or the whole ruse wouldn't have worked, but they didn't, and so it does. So let's see how that happens, starting here in verse 31. And we ended with Reuben's plaintive cry, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" And we looked last time at the poetic sounding language of that, va'ani, ana, ani, va, and we'll see how that's parallel to Jacob's language, translated very woodenly here. I shall go down to Sheol with my son mourning, which even not a literary critic like Westerman notes is impossible to translate the original Hebrew, and we'll look at that soon. So here's what they do. And to situate our passage, let's note the distances. They're up here in Dothan somewhere, and last time we heard, the only time, in fact, we're going to hear in this entire story where Jacob is, other than Canaan, is that he was down here in Hebron. And he sent them from Hebron to Shechem, which we noted at the time was symbolically the journey from the beginning of the united monarchy with David to the end of the united monarchy with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, both made king in Shechem, and Shechem rebuilt by Jeroboam. So we've seen how this is symbolic of all that. But now we don't hear those places mentioned, but the last time we heard, Jacob was back here in Hebron. So the robe is going to have to go a long way to get back to him. And there's an ambiguity about whether it goes with them or without, and we'll see that as we go. So here's what they do. Ignoring Reuben's cry, they, presumably all of them, but it's not clear, they took Joseph's robe, and highlighting that he's being named specifically here, it had been stripped from him in verse 23 before they threw him in the pit, slaughtered a goat. Presumably they have goats because they're out shepherding, and they would have sheep and goats, as Jacob got from Laban in all those years and had been built up here. The word for slaughter, though, echoes as Abraham was about to do to Isaac in 22:10, and that's the only elsewhere in Genesis out of 86 times in the Hebrew Scripture, mostly in Exodus, Leviticus, which isn't surprising in terms of ritual sacrifice. As Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg notes below, in Jewish history, the event is remembered, quote, as, quote, a kind of ineradicable original sin with proliferating effects, unquote, for which goats continued to be sacrificed for all communal offerings, according to the medieval commentator Ramban. But the word for goat makes it even more poignant. It's a Sa'ir Izim here, literally a hairy kid. And Sa'ir, the place where Jacob's brother Esau resided, because the land resembled his body in terms of vegetation as hairiness. And yet it also recalls how Jacob confused his father, or did he? Looking back at chapter 27, who was the trick really on? But at least he thought he was confusing his father by following his mother Rebekah's advice to wear a goatskin gloves, so to speak, on his hands to fool his father that the hairy hands were those of Esau. And now the sons fool the father with the hairy goat blood, but not the hairy goat itself. And so ironically, he doesn't see the hairy goat. They see the hairy goat. Do they know about how their father tricked their uncle back in the day? Maybe not, but we know. And dip the robe in the blood. The verb for dip here, tavel, is only here in Genesis. I wondered whether the Septuagint would render it as baptizo, but it doesn't. It uses meluno there, not to dip, but to defile, making a moral judgment on what's going on here. So the robe is now defiled, according to the Septuagint, in the blood. And as Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg also notes again from the medieval commentator Rashi, he says in Hebrew, dam domei ladam adam. Goat's blood is similar to human blood. And he was noting the wordplay there. She notes the wordplay between blood, dam, and human, adam, as we noted way back in the beginning with Cain and Abel, as we saw there. So much of the brotherly violence is being remembered here by readers, if not by characters. So now the robe is dipped in blood, and Joseph, remembers, on the way to Egypt, but the father is 80 miles away. And what we see in verse 32 is incredibly ambiguous with the passive voice here. And Westermann notes that there are two verbs, had and taken, confused with subject and object. It's a question of whether they took it or had it sent with the messenger. As Wenham notes, either avoiding direct confrontation or, quote, a brazen effrontery, neither reading puts their feelings for their father in a good light. In other words, either they brought it or they've sent it with a messenger who would also be carrying this message. We see in verse 35 that they're there, but it could well be that they were afraid to actually go directly, and they continued shepherding and whatever else they were doing out there and sent with a messenger, perhaps the man they saw wandering in the field, back to their father, so they don't have to face the grief of their father. It's a cowardly, horrible act on their part, and obviously does not portray the brothers in any kind of a decent light. And they said, and again it's ambiguous whether this is live them speaking or a message they sent on. We see that if it is a question of messengers, at least implicitly, that's a deep echo of the David story, especially the David story around the Bathsheba scene, which will echo into Genesis 38 with the Tamar and Judah scene, as we'll see, around messengers. But we don't know. It's ambiguous. It could be read either way. They said, this we have found. Again, the passive voice. And of course, they didn't find it. They had it and made it happen. So it's not only a hideous thing, it's obviously a complete lie. Notice they don't say what it is. They just simply invite him to recognize it. See now does not convey it. It's the word recognize, which is what it responds to in verse 33. At least the translation has it there. But it's certainly a key word in the next chapter, as you can see in 38, 25, and 26, when Tamar asked Judah to recognize the objects that he'd given what he thought was the prostitute as a payment in anticipation of actually paying her, surety. So as my note below has, as Jacob wished his father falsely to recognize him, now his sons want him falsely to recognize Joseph's death. And as Jacob's attempt at false recognition comes back here to haunt him, so will the brothers, as Joseph uses their non-recognition of him against them when he's the vizier of Egypt and they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. So the idea of recognizing is going to be key throughout, but as I've been noting, the next three chapters are all about recognizing via close, holding 37, 38, and 39 so tightly together. So it's offered as an open-ended question. Recognize whether or not this is your son's long robe with sleeves here. And he recognized it. How could he not recognize it? It's not the Technicolor dream coat, of course, but it is a relatively rare coat. The only time it's ever mentioned again in the Bible is Tamar, the daughter of David. And as I've noted at the time, it's traditionally, as Sarna has noted, a garment of royal princesses. So in many ways, it's like a dress. And some have raised the question of what it says about Joseph's sexuality, but we can raise that question when Joseph's sexuality is brought up explicitly in chapter 39 and what follows. So he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe." Notice that he didn't say Joseph the first time, simply my son. A wild animal, or as we've been noting the translation, an evil animal, has devoured him. And that frames, as you can see with the chiasm all the way back to verse 20, Falcoman's chiasm that links 37:18 all the way through 33, overlapping the chiasm that I was noting with the Midianites and the framing there. But here's the part where it's so poignant it cannot be translated. Taraf, Toraf, Yosef. And as Westerman notes, not possible to render the cry. So both as Reuben had an alliterative, poetic-sounding expression of mourning, so does Jacob here. And we see his mourning in incredible detail. For a person who's been so quiet and so passive, suddenly it overflows here. And we can see it in two ways, both in a chiasm that, again, Falcoman points out for us that I can put on the screen here, and also this long sequence. And I just want to highlight them one at a time so we can see just how much. He tears his garments. He puts on sackcloth. He mourned for many days. He refused to be comforted. He spoke of going to Sheol to his son. He described his mourning again, and he bewailed him. That's much more than what David does for the love child between him and Bathsheba, and resembling what he did to Absalom. But unlike David with Absalom, who had Joab to say, "The soldiers are waiting for you to get back in battle," David was responsible for Absalom's death, and Jacob is certainly not responsible for what he understands to be Joseph's death, although we know that he doesn't, that Joseph is not yet dead. And so he'll be doing all this mourning, simply all this suffering put on by the brothers' cowardice. So we hear his name Jacob here, and this is the first time he's been named since the first two verses. He will not be named again until chapter 42 because he won't be in the story until then. And he's unknowingly in solidarity with Reuben in terms of tearing the garments, who's now restored, as far as we can tell, to conspiratorial solidarity with his brothers. So he tore his garments, echoing exactly verse 29, and put sackcloth on. And this is the only time we hear sackcloth, literally sack in the Hebrew. We'll see it later as simply as a sack. We don't know anything about what the audience would have thought the tradition was, since we haven't seen it in Genesis, but it's obviously some kind of form of mourning. On his loins is provided by the Septuagint. That's not in the Hebrew there, so I didn't add that part. And mourned for his son many days. And the word for mourning here, Val, only here in Genesis, but it's a very similar word in the next verse. For many days. And we don't know how many, but the mourning for abundant days, which is the literal meaning of it, frames with the proclamation we see at 45:28, which we can look at here. Israel, as he's called there, says, "Enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die." So he found that out from the brothers, and that'll frame it all the way down to chapter 45. So it'll take 8 chapters and many years for him to discover the truth. And so now we see them gather around him. And as White notes below, the removal of the envy Joseph, as with the death of Abel, rather than bringing the criminals into a new intimacy with their father, as Cain desired with God, has apparently made such intimacy forever impossible. So we see all his sons and all his daughters, and that's one of the examples that leads some to see different sources, that a source that would have Jacob have many daughters. But, of course, any source here that would be adding to the Jacob story, adding to Genesis, certainly knows the Jacob story, and any editor that would insert this at the end of the book of Genesis would know that the story has only the one daughter, Dinah. It's only just a few chapters earlier. So I suggest this is not about sources, but about daughters in the sense of daughters-in-law. We don't know anything about his sons being married, and that's not a focus of the story. But it's certainly a reasonable understanding that sons and daughters are suggesting all his family around him. Sought to comfort him. Lenachamav, as Westerman notes, not only that they spoke words of comfort, but rather they wanted to bring about a change and have Jacob put an end to the rites of mourning. Probably because they can't stand it emotionally. It's not that Jacob needs to get back to something as David needed to get back to the battle. He has no particular immediate purpose that we know of. But it's just very painful for them all to see him suffering so over, after all, their own brother or brother-in-law's apparent death. But he refused to be comforted there. And here, according to Rashi, as you note below from Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg notes, it suggests an unconscious knowledge that Joseph is still alive. Quote, "One does not accept comfort for someone who is still alive, even though one thinks he is dead." He refused here. It will come up again in 48:19, and its flip side, amen, which you can see there without the vowel. So it's an affirmation as opposed to here, which is a disaffirmation. He refused to be comforted. And so said, no, I will go down to Sheol. And the going down to Sheol here echoes 37:25, just a few verses earlier, putting Joseph in the pit, which of course Jacob doesn't know anything about. This is the first time that Sheol is mentioned in Genesis, and we'll see it's a couple more times. It's 65 times in Hebrew scripture. The etymology is uncertain, and it's unknown in other ancient Semitic languages. It's definitely not hell, although the Septuagint will later translate it as Hades, which is also not hell. But as my note below has, it has several meanings. It's simply the abode of the dead, without any sense of judgment, as simply a dark underground cavern, so just a place underneath the fertile soil and the top layer of rocks, or as a metaphorical expression for death itself, as we sometimes see in the Psalms. But what he's going down there, he imagined to do, is to be gathered with his son. So if he can't be gathered with him in this life, he imagines he can gather with him in some kind of shadowy place underground. And we see in the books of Samuel that Saul goes to the woman of Endor to have Samuel called up. The only time we ever see anything about someone from the dead being brought back, not to life in the sense of resurrection or even restoration, as in John's Gospel with Lazarus, but simply as a shade, as a dead person being brought up to be spoken to. But then he goes right back. So he suggests he will go down to my son mourning, and using the variation of the verb we just saw in the earlier verse, only here in the Torah and 2 times in the prophets. So thus his father bewailed him. And this is 13 times in Genesis, and we've seen it earlier. And so we leave Jacob there, and we leave the whole story there, and that's certainly meant to be so. Anybody who would think that chapter 38 was added later is missing the incredible artistry of these authors to leave us with Jacob mourning while another scene continues. But we have one more verse to close the chiasm and to highlight where it's going. The meanwhile is not in the Hebrew here, so often the initial words are not, and the story will continue here at 39. The Midianites, and this is actually a different form, Midianites, although most scholars suggest it's the same group, just a different variation spelling, had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. So that's the second time Joseph's been sold, and hence the double use of selling here, although we've seen it 3 times. The proposal of selling, then the selling from the Ishmaelites to the Midianites, and then the Midianites to Potiphar. And that's the first time we hear of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's Sarim here, and we'll see much more about Potiphar, at least about Potiphar's wife in chapter 39, where he's described here as a captain of the guard, Asar Hababakai, Habakim there, sorry. And we see it a number of times, and we'll see, and when we get to chapter 39, a key connection with 2 Kings 25, the very end of the Deuteronomistic history, but we'll look at those connections there. So chapter 37 leaves the brothers unable to comfort their father and Jacob mourning, but Judah will have other things to do, as we'll see in the next story, only to be out-tricked by his daughter-in-law, Tamar, and we'll see that beginning next time. See you then. Bye-bye.